Welcome to Electric Evolution with Liz Allan. This podcast is about the journey to a more sustainable future in order for us to be able to do our bit to achieve net zero. I'll be discussing a variety of topics with experts in their field in order to educate and increase our knowledge of clean energy, electric vehicles and the electric vehicle infrastructure. So whether you're an individual wanting to make a difference at home, a small business or a corporate, this podcast is just for you. Today, I've got a really important person on the podcast. I really wanted to bring him on because I think he's such an important person for the sector, the EV and EV charging sector, to actually be engaging with. So I have got Ian Trott on. Ian, we've met once. It was a joy to meet you. Thank you ever so much for joining me today.
Well, I'm privileged that you invited me. Thank you so much. I've been a fan of yours for a long time and I love your shows. And it was lovely to meet you in London. It was great. Really enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed the event.
I did. And actually it made me realise how much I needed to get you on here. So Ian is a freelance graphic designer, aren't you?
Yeah, I am indeed.
And a big EV kind of, you're very passionate about electric vehicles.
I am. I mean, from way back when. So yeah, I mean, do you want me to? I was brought up in the motorsport world, so I'm used to the smell of Castrol. That's my earliest memories. The smell of Castrol. You're going to say what? Castrol is wonderful.
You mean as in? I know Castrol GTX. I remember that one.
Castrol. They use it in racing as like an upper cylinder head lubricant, and it burns with the fuel. And it's got this really distinctive smell. Probably really bad for you, actually. But it's when you're little. It's sort of very distinctive. And but yeah, I've always been fascinated by alternate power sources. So when I was a kid, I got this little book of land speed record holders, and I was amazed to find that one of the first land speed record holders was an electric vehicle.
Was it? Goodness me.
So that's well over 100 years ago, and I was like, electric. And so yeah, from then on, I've always had a mind to alternate fuels. Even though my father's business he worked a lot in petrochemical industry, out in Saudi and whatnot, looking at fuel metering, supplied some Formula One teams with fuel metering units when they refueled in the 80s. And then he went on to filling station design in the 90s and whatnot. So, I was earliest memories of kids going around collecting old petrol pumps and doing them up, that sort of thing. So, it makes me laugh when people say, well, I'd like to see you charge your car when you got a power cut. And it's like, yeah, okay. And tell me, how do the petrol pumps work? Electric motors. So that's sort of coming from that background. So I've always been interested in alternate fueling, be that hydrogen, LPG, electricity. Electricity is the obvious one to me because it's the most efficient way of getting power source from origination to propulsion. Makes sense, really. I drove my first EV on the road. I can't remember the exact date, but it was the mid-90s.
What was it? Was it?
It was.
Can you remember what it was then?
Yeah, I can. It was a Peugeot 205, and it was the experimental Peugeot 205. And I worked at the city council at the time, and these were out and about. And basically, it had the front seats, but the whole of the rear seats and the boot was just lead acid batteries, and it had a range of about 35 miles and took about a day to charge. But Peugeot were experimenting with the time, and when we did the event in London, the MP at the end, is it Mike Watson? I think it was, from memory, who gave the talk, the roundup talk. He mentioned about he was from Peugeot and he worked at Viton, and they had the 106 there, which was the model later on after the 205. So I drove that for a bit. I had the opportunity to drive it at the city council, and it was a strange feeling the first time you stop to go across a junction because there's no engine running. You think like, oh, what happens now when I put my foot on the throttle? Will it go? But interestingly, in that short drive, I soon realised that the throttle pedal isn't really a throttle pedal as such. Like most people get very hung up about regen, throttle pedal, brake pedal, all this lot. The throttle pedal is actually a speed modulator.
Right.
So when you use regen, instead of sometimes turning regen on and off, you don't want to get too hung up about putting your foot on the throttle, because you can slow down still having your foot on the throttle pedal. You're just modulating how much you slow down. It's quite interesting. So yeah, it's not an on-off thing. It's there'll be an area of travel. Then when you go to the brake, that goes first of all to regen and then to physical brake. So there's a real balance between them. So yeah, interesting. But so now I was fascinated with the Peugeot 205, and then being a wheelchair user, I lived about 6 miles from where I was working. And when was it 2000, I got something called a power trike when it came out, which is like half an electric bicycle that fitted to the front of my wheelchair. And that uses lead acid batteries. And I go into work on that and back each day. So that was good fun. But it's interesting because I had to do a battery swap on the way in, because the batteries would only, you could only just about get in on both batteries. So you'd use one battery, so it was almost fully depleted. You swap batteries over, and then lead acid had a habit of sort of slightly recovering in that time you used in the second one. So you'd probably get an extra half mile out of it. So that would just get me into work, and then I charge up at work. Then they banned me from that. But of course, the kicker is, unlike an electric bike, if you run out where you can pedal, electric with an attachment like that, if you run out and you are stuck, and that's that. So you had to have a very good eye for what the terrain you were using, hills and such like that, and your route in and out would change depending on where you could get some good terrain to maximize your distance.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
So yeah.
So you've kind of go on, sorry.
Well, yeah, I could say then obviously on Motability, we've got an old van. I looked to get that converted to LPG, but could never quite afford it. There was a few drawbacks, but I liked the idea of that. And then the Leaf came out, and I was really interested in the Leaf. I like the earlier C0 and all those that came out in the late 90s, or I forgot what the G-Wiz, that came out in 15 years ago. I'd quite like to look at those. But when I discovered that Motability was going to start offering EVs, I thought brilliant. So I test drove Nissan LEAF for a week in 2014. That was an interesting experience, which really brought it home to me that dealers know nothing. Yeah, so off I set with the family from Leicester down to Milton Keynes, because I knew they had a lot of infrastructure for charging, and the distance was further than the range. So I thought, that's no problem, we'll charge. When we got there, the dealer gave me this Ecotricity card, because that will work everywhere. No, it doesn't work everywhere. So obviously Milton Keynes was all Polar back in the day, which meant a different subscription. I was like, oh God, that's great. So we didn't charge. So on the way back, I thought I'd charge at the motorways. But then I realized that I actually had a lot less range than I thought, and I had to charge imminently. And I faced getting onto the motorway, not knowing which was my closest charge point, north or south. I should really be heading north, but I thought, well, it may be better to go south to get a charge than to go north. And I had no way of finding out. So we just chanced it, and we made it to the services with about a mile left, and there was somebody already on charge. So I had my wife and all the kids with me. Don't think she was too happy about that, because it was winter time as well, so it was bitterly cold. Eventually we got charged and we got back, and I remember my wife saying, I'm never going in another electric car again. God. But next day I ordered one, so
oh, you really took notice of her then.
Oh yeah, I thought she'd come round. So yeah, she did. So that was good. No, she loves the EVs as well, but we've never actually run out of charge, because for me to run out of charge would be pretty catastrophic. So taken it close loads of times, but never run out. So I've probably done about, I don't know, 150 odd thousand miles, used lots of different EVs over the years, never turned down a chance to test drive anything.
Of course.
And using EVs is much easier for me, because I don't have to have the adaptation. I could drive.
I was just about to ask you that. Do you have to have an adapted car then?
Well, if I was, like, say, paraplegic, I would have to have an adapted car, but I'm a left leg amputee, so I can just get straight in and drive most automatics.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. So
of course.
I can drive manual, and I regularly did drive manual with a hand clutch control unit, which is very very heavy and difficult
Yeah.
to use. But then
Yeah.
that requires you at some points not to have any hands on the wheel, especially when you're going around the roundabouts and stuff like that. When I wear prosthetic, I could also just about get away with putting my foot on the clutch, pushing down. But you learn to do clutchless gear changes quite quickly and just sort of adapt like that. If you can rev match, you can clutchless change. The difficult bit is starting off and stopping. Well, you can stop's not so bad, it's just knocking into neutral, but starting is the bit where you have to have a bit of clutch control. So yeah.
But I suppose that's why an electric's going to be so much better. Like you
so
say,
much
your
better.
regen, it's just one pedal driving, isn't it?
And here's the irony: you see, for a lot of disabled people, having an EV should be a real opportunity to open the floodgates of accessibility, because you don't have those constraints of physical drivetrain, physical connection. You can have drive by wire easy enough. You don't have to have those physical connections to the carburetors, to open and close the throttle bodies and all that, to accelerate the gearbox and all that. It's all going to be remote. So there's much more scope for adaptation, more complex adaptations. There's a huge amount of scope. It should be so much easier. Manufacturers should come out to it from a clean slate. You've got a clean slate now. You don't have to design vehicles as they've always been. You don't, your filler cap is there because your petrol tank is where it is. It's funny because a lot of people make a big thing about where's your filler, or even not even know where they fit, not what side their filler is. I've driven loads of vehicles back in the day where your petrol tank wasn't where you'd assume it is. My T25 van, I've got petrol tanks at the front, it fills at the front. It's just a logical place for it. BW Beetle was that, the old Tramp Spitfire, petrol cap was in the middle, so it didn't matter which side you're coming from. So with EVs, there's a huge scope for vehicle manufacturers to really do something clean sheet, something different. I like the look of the Canoe that's in America. I don't know whether that'll actually happen or not. But is it the Callum that Motability were working on the design study? That's interesting because that's got multiple charge points. See, I believe multiple charge points is a big positive for disabled people.
So theoretically then, where would the multiple charge points need to be?
Well,
Front,
you see
side,
now,
back, dependent on what you need?
Varies tremendously on the person and the vehicle. So I've used an I-Pace, charge point in the wing. Didn't like the I-Pace, awful car. But anyway, not efficient, terrible. In the front wings is not an ideal place for a charge point at all. I think the nose is a very good place, but also a lot of people like the rear wings, both sides. For me, I use my wheel when I have my wheelchair in the vehicle, it's in the boot, and I use my crutches to get to the boot. So I have to have access to the boot, which means predominantly I have to drive into bays. Other wheelchair users would say people do things differently. If you're a paraplegic traveling on your own, you will inevitably put the wheelchair on the passenger seat, which means you have to sort of dismantle your wheelchair roadside, collapse your seat, bring it over you, and put it into it's a palaver, but but of course you can't do that if you're traveling with somebody else. So inevitably that other person will put the wheelchair in the boot or your mobility aids. And the main thing is it's about remaining independent, because for anybody to live in society, you've got to have your ability to be independent and not rely on somebody else. So, rely on somebody else to doctor's appointment, hospital appointment, going out anywhere, going to work, going to work would become untenable if you always had to bring somebody with you. Can you imagine it? It would be, I know it does happen, but you have to have your independence. You have to have your independence. So, if you do need a carer to come with you, then that has to be built into the work environment that you have that. But just to, for me to go to hospital appointment now, I've got to have the independence to do that myself. You can't rely on public transport as a disabled person, unfortunately, because even though a lot of legislation's going into place, like the Equalities Act 2010, it still hasn't caught up. Like near where I live, the bus stops don't have the raised platform. In actual fact, the bus stop nearest me is on a big speed table. So the road is actually the same height as the pavement, so you've got a huge drop. So you'd never be able to get the bus there. I'd have to go quite a way down to get the bus. So these little things, you just have to. It's so important to have your own independence with the vehicle, which means if you value your independence, you've got to be able to fuel it independently, whether that's petrol, diesel, electric, hydrogen, whatever. You've got to be able to do that process independently. Otherwise, suddenly you're reliant upon another person. And inevitably, that works better at a petrol station when they're open, because you do have something called fuel serve, where you can actually call somebody out to do that for you. But of course, most charging infrastructure is unmanned by its very nature. So that means it's even more important for it to be accessible. Because a lot of people say to me, well, how do you manage to fill? Personally, I can fill with petrol or diesel, but you're more likely to have staff there to help when needs be. And that's part of the Equalities Act, that they had to bring in a means for people to be able to get assistance at filling stations. Otherwise, they'd contravene the Equalities Act 2010. So hence the need for the fuel serve app, or sound your horn, flash your lights. There'll be some notification at the pumps what you do for help, but obviously that doesn't work later at night when they close the shutters down, because the staff can't come out. So you still are restricted to when you can travel as a salesperson oftentimes, which is a bit frustrating, but you just got to plan. So making the leap to an EV isn't as big as a leap it would be for somebody that's never thought about, can I access a pump? Because you've already got this access issue in your mind, which is sometimes added barriers can be a positive.
Yeah, but like you say, the ones that are unmanned, of which they're mostly unmanned, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
What do we need to do especially, kind of in the UK, we've got to over 60,000 chargers now, haven't we?
Yeah.
What do we need to do to change this?
It's going to have to be a mixture in all reality, because statistically, a higher proportion of disabled people don't have access to off-street parking. So the option for them to charge at home is not going to be as easy. So you've got to be able to make the infrastructure as accessible as possible. Now, a lot of the infrastructure has been aimed at car parking, which has got a place, but to me, you're fueling a vehicle. The car parking model works where you've got destination charging, so say you go into shopping centres, cinemas, that sort of thing. Yeah, that works, but it's got to be accessible. But that can be got around because, ironically, the earliest installations of infrastructure tended to be in disabled bays, which caused a lot of friction in the world of disability, because suddenly your disabled bays were disappearing with these funny posts without being people told it. But the upside was, for me, they were very accessible. But as it's moved on, this has not happened. So they've become less accessible, bizarrely. So
they're becoming narrower.
Becoming narrower, yeah.
As in a normal car space,
a normal car space,
disabled,
yeah.
disabled
So
space size.
When you park your vehicle, you normally park your vehicle and get out and go. If you're a parent, you've got a bit more palaver, but then you've got parent and toddler bays, which have got a bit more space, because you need to get your pushchair and all that sort of stuff out, and the child that doesn't want to get out and wants to I want my whatever, that they've dropped. Yeah. So you've got all those things to contend with. So having any sort of infrastructure in just normal parking bays for me is a big no-no, because normal parking bays were regulated in the, I can't remember now, 70s, and cars have got remarkably bigger. People have got bigger. Yeah, it's what it is. You go with an old sailing ship and they're like all 4 foot something, weren't they? So yeah. And so that hasn't been catered for in car parks. They haven't taken haven't gone in lockstep with vehicle development. So vehicles now, you typically, any parking space you go in, you really got to squeeze out, haven't you? Just open your door a fraction and squeeze out. So adding charging infrastructure to that is a big no-no, because as soon as you plug in, whether it's front, back or side, your charge nozzle sticking out, so you've lost that gap, especially if you've got vehicles that charge on opposing sides at the rear. You know, most manufacturers are going to rear wing charging, but some are left, some are right, you know, near side, offside. If you got a mismatch and you park up with somebody, you've actually totally blocked yourself in, and that's for an able-bodied person in a normal space. So I think installing infrastructure into normal car parking spaces is just totally and utterly impractical, but that's what everybody is doing. For me, my pet thing is, I mean, when I first got an EV, I just thought, well, angled bays are the way to go, because then you don't get any clashes of doors, clashes of charge ports or anything. I drew something up years ago. I got to redraw it actually because it was a bit rubbish, but yeah, just to sort of settle my mind on would angled bays work. And yes, it does involve reversing in or reversing out, but it could be practical, because on an angled bay, if you stick all the bays on an angle, you create a natural void triangle space in that sort of stacking. So that void triangle space is where the charger would go.
So those are what you call are they herringbone bays?
Yeah, herringbone bays. Yeah.
I always, do you know what? I've got to say, I have problems getting into those, because I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so I like to go in straight. I want to be, and I hate being
you
cockeyed.
You would need a mirror of those. So you got road, you need a mirror of those for which side you charge, or so you go up or down. But that was just my personal viewpoint. I think that the whole process of charging a vehicle should be given far more attention. So, for example, if you want to design and build a filling station, you've got a myriad of regulations to go through, and rightly so, because you're dealing with a very explosive material. And then not only that, you've got fuel spillage, so you've got water runoff, and where's the water runoff going to be collected to? It can't go into the watercourses and pollute, you know, all these complications, and even down to fire safety. So, for example, you know, refueling, you've always got to have a means of escape for the tanker, so it has to be able to exit quickly. And then even down to putting the fire out, you know, you've got water runoff issues there again. So there's loads of stuff involved in designing filling station. So for a charge point, you can just plonk a post in the ground, and now they're pushing to even go down the permitted development route. So you could just add a post, destination charge post. You wouldn't need to go through planning as such, which means if you don't go through planning, the whole aspect of accessibility never rears its head, because nobody ever looks at what that means for planning. So I'm against the permitted development route. And yes, it's great that we're having this massive race to install infrastructure, but the trouble is with that race, the practicality, the usability, are we installing the right equipment in the right place for the right clientele? It's all been forgotten about. We're just banging them in, and then we're not even thinking about maintenance contracts and all this. Yeah, so I would really rein back on it and say, look, this has got to be legislated. That's where something like PAS comes into it, PAS 1899. I've got some criticisms on that, but it's a first step. So for me, the charging infrastructure has to be suitable to be used in a myriad of different ways. So that's going to be vehicles which are towing, because lots of people tow.
Yeah.
You know, it may sound a bit odd, but they do tow.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's a little trailer for you, but little trailers. And you can't unhitch. If you're disabled, the last thing you can do is unhitch, move your trailer somewhere else, get back in, especially if that's containing your mobility scooter or whatever. Height restriction, again, is another issue, because a lot of mobility vehicles like EWAVs, their height, their vans, height restriction barriers normally 2 meters. A lot of EWAVs are higher than 2 meters. Right. A lot of people have these top boxes on their vehicles, not so many nowadays, but they present your wheelchair to you. The top box goes up, it brings your wheelchair down.
Right, okay.
Yeah, you can't use that in a height restricted.
Makes it higher, yeah.
It makes it higher, but also as it opens up to 90 degrees, and it drops your wheelchair down beside you. So they're opening up to a fair old height. They're less popular now than they used to be, but they're still around, those sort of adaptations, because if you're traveling independently, you need to be able to do that sort of thing. So for me, we need to look at it much more as a filling station type scenario, which is more heavily regulated. Our present government hates regulation. You know, market forces, all that lot. You know,
no comment.
Market forces, you know, survival of the fittest. We all know that, and that obviously impacts on those that need something extra. So, yeah, it was. I got notices. Your meeting is being recorded. Okay, yeah, I know it is. I know you recorded it. Just popped up. So yeah, so destination charging is a massively important part of the whole infrastructure, massive and often overlooked, but that needs to be fully accessible too. A lot of people talk about having rapid chargers fully accessible. Absolutely, but destination charging is equally important to be fully accessible, because any vehicle is only going to be used for a fraction of the time it's on your ownership. You're only driving short periods of time, unless you're a rep and you're going up and down the motorway permanently. But then is that efficient? I don't know. But yeah, having fully accessible destination charging is important. Restaurants, hotels, cinemas, really, really, really important. You just can't bang these posts in on the curbs into normal sized bays. No. It's asking for all sorts of problems. Then, of course, you end up with extra things like bollards and wheel stops to stop you hitting something which actually is put in the wrong place. If you've got to put things in front of it to stop it being hit, then it's in the wrong place. That's what I think. You know, it's
but then, I mean, some of them are put on curbs, aren't they? And that's hard for you to access in a wheelchair and all sorts, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, curbs is the worst. That's why it has to be looked at carefully. And I don't have the answers for it, apart from the herringbone angled bay scheme. But it has to be looked at by people who really understand what they're talking about and can look at it in detail and work out all the ins and outs of it. But you have to go for a wide spectrum of people. So at the moment, there's not many EWAVs on the road, but they will be coming to market. There's lots of issues to solve around EWAVs, but they're working on it. And there is an EWAV version of my vehicle, the Berlingo, because it doesn't have a battery under the boot. Bizarrely, the boot's empty. It's not even got a spare wheel, but we won't talk about that. There's a space for it, but it's not there.
There's a lot of those that are like that. And for those people who don't know what an EWAV is, so maybe we should talk about some of these terms. So EWAV is electric wheelchair accessible vehicle.
And they can take many forms. Yeah.
And when Ian was talking about PAS, PAS 1899 is it's guidance, isn't it? It's not being mandated, but it relates to accessible vehicle charging. Now, it's kind of, the word guidance kind of gives away the fact that I would say the fact it's not being mandated is an issue, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I don't want to blame the government, but
you do really. Go on.
They had the choice. You know, we can make it mandatory. So how I see PAS fit into it. So the overarching, the umbrella legislation really was originally the Disability Discrimination Act, but that then got superseded by the Equalities Act. So a lot of things got rolled into one. You know, race, whatever, it all got rolled into one with disability as well. The Equalities Act 2010, which means you can't basically discriminate against disabled people. If something's publicly accessible, it's publicly accessible to everybody. You can't say, oh, apart from you can't use it. So that's your baseline. But of course, EV charging's come on since then. But it doesn't alter the fact it's got to be, by law, publicly accessible. you've got to be able to use it no matter what. But of course, a lot of people in the business needed guidance of that, exactly what is accessible. It's all well and good saying accessible, but what does it mean? What does accessible mean? What's the definition of it?
Drilling down into it, isn't it?
Yeah, they need to know the nuts and bolts and nitty gritty. And that can take so many different forms for different segments of the industry, whether that's equipment providers, local authorities that are looking at installation, private landowners, CPOs, charge point operators. And they all fight against each other. They all want to pass the buck because nobody wants to take the hot potato. And it's great to blame somebody else, isn't it? Because it's not your problem. It's life. That's what humans do. So PAS 1899 was developed, and it is a first step because some of the parts on there contradict each other, and it's a very big document. And it doesn't cover things like EWAVs, which is, wheelchair accessible vehicles, which can be wheelchair accessible vehicles for passengers or for drivers drive from wheelchair. So there's a whole massive scope within that. But inevitably, you will have whacking great ramp out the back or out the side, and you're talking huge ramps, 2.5 meters, or lifts. Or I know people have got them both front and back and side.
Yes.
So there's a huge scope, and those vehicles will have to go to EV if we are following the path, which we are, that all vehicles will be EV. Pick a date. Well, we won't go there, but it's a
pick a date, any date. There we go.
Any date. Get the dartboard. Anyway, So we need to make sure that the infrastructure is suitable for everybody. Now, what form that takes is open for discussion, because as it's developed at the moment, PAS 1899 doesn't fully cover EWAVs because there aren't many EWAVs on the market, but it will have to. It will have to, and there's a crossover there with commercial charging as well for more commercial vehicles, because they have the similar sort of constraints on size and accessibility. So there's a lot of crossover that we could learn from, a lot of crossover. And I actually had this discussion with somebody about commercial vehicles, and they said, well, none of the charge points have to be accessible. I said, well, yes, they do, because I know people that drive HGVs. I know wheelchair users that drive HGVs. They have a little hoist come down the side, and their wheelchair, goes up in the cab. So you do need wheelchair accessible. Just because you'd say, well, doesn't mean you should be restricted from a certain level of work.
Absolutely, I totally get you.
So the nature of it, what PAS 1899 will develop to, is really needs a lot of input, and it needs input from all sectors, because they've all got to work towards it.
And users as well.
Yes,
we talked about this before we were recording, didn't we? That actually introducing something without asking people.
Oh God, yeah, you've got to have it.
What is the point?
And they think we're coming from a point where the majority of disabled people still haven't transitioned to EVs because it's too much of a leap for them. They can't even get to. Sometimes they can't even get to test drive them. You can't even get the first step along the way. And it's very. I don't know anybody else in the wheelchair basketball world that has an EV, and I know a lot of people in the wheelchair basketball world that do a lot of traveling. All wheelchair users of some type, but I don't know anybody else that's got an EV, which is shocking. I know a lot of people that want to look at an EV. It's really bad. Motability is the biggest lease fleet, but only a fraction. I don't know what percentage, but only 50% of disabled people use Motability. So you've got a whole other section of disabled people that don't use Motability. So you can never look at it just as Motability. It has to be a much wider gamut, and that's where the guidance for PAS 1899 should work. But then there's an awareness of it, and a lot of CPOs, landowners, local authorities, they haven't got a clue what it is. There's no connection. There's no vehicle at the moment to drive it forward. There's too many disconnects. It has to be more, what's the word I was going to say? Homogeneous. Joined up, yeah. You need much more joined up thinking. One thing leads to another, leads to another. and
Yeah.
they all have impacts on each other. So, for example, where I live, the local authorities, because close by, a lot of the villages are terraced houses, they've put destination charges in the car parks, which is brilliant. And I had spoken to them several years before this and pointed out the need for them to be accessible, because a lot of people living in those properties are disabled as well, in one way, shape, or form. Not one charge point is accessible, not one. They've even gone to the extent of putting them on curbs and bump stops. You got to love it. Curbs and bump stops.
God.
Really? And then somebody said to me, oh, well, why are bump stops a problem? Well, bump stops are there to stop a car. They're going to do a very good job of stopping a wheelchair as well. And they also, this is how crazy it is. My wheelchair is about 750 mil wide, 750 millimeters, yeah. Inevitably, bump stops will be installed somewhere around 650 to 700 millimeters from the curb. Then you have the charge point about 50 centimeters, 500 mil from the curb, and then another 650 to 700 millimeters from the curb to the bump stop. So you're already a meter and a half, 2 meters away from the charge point. And I don't know many people with arms that long. Hence my little video of playing the hoopla with the
Yes, we'll talk
yes.
about that in a second. I was going to talk to you about you've been working with Kate Tyrrell from ChargeSafe, because obviously Kate's doing a really good job trying to
doing
make
a great
sure
job.
make sure that charge points are more accessible. And she's now kind of working with you, isn't she? And you where was it where you went for
well, there's a few of us that she's working with.
Mm.
So I went with another guy called Chris, who's really knows his stuff. And she's also meeting with Craig, who also knows his stuff as well. That's more north. We went to Bristol and we looked at quite a few different charge points, just to sort of reaffirm their critique of what works and what doesn't work as far as accessibility. And look at some different things. So there was one charge point that I looked at, which was a new development, which surprised me greatly at a big superstore beginning with a T. They put these charge points in, and yes, on the face of it, it looked accessible, but they were on little islands of curbs, and those islands ate into the accessible space. But then not only that, from a safety point of view, the charge point's backed onto a main road with some bushes. So at night time, you'd feel it would feel a bit more, especially if you were vulnerable. I'm the worst person to talk about that, because I'm a bit mad and I don't really consider safety. I've just charged in the weirdest of places, but yeah, another story. But and also the fact that if you're charging, you're going to be charging at especially this site. Well, personally, I think they're the wrong type of charges, because they weren't destination charges, they were rapid charges. And if you're a business, especially a retail part, you want to hold people there as long as possible. You don't want to be forcing them to think, 40 minutes, I've got to get back to the car. It's a business thing, isn't it? So, but from the charge points, which were all lovely, there was no safe route to any of the shops without walking on the inner car park roads. And it was on a bit of a bend. So you think, you're just waiting for your local wide boy in a, souped up Vauxhall Corsa to come around there. And it's, because you are encouraging people to move on the roadway. There should be a pavement area. And what they've basically done is they've installed in parking bays and just made that little bit extra space. So on the face of it, it looked very accessible. But when you drill down, there was some issues, about the overall environment and the way, at least that's what I thought there were.
And I was going to say, sometimes from what I understand as well, it's not one party to point the finger at. It's kind of, there's multiple, it's landowners who have already designed a site, for example, and they've just literally said all the parking bays are going to stay the same, and what we're going to do is we're going to actually add chargers onto those parking bays.
Absolutely.
And actually, for a charge point operator to go in and bid on something like that, it's quite difficult, isn't it? Because how,
Yeah.
they probably want to, a lot of the charge point operators do want to be providing accessible spaces, or
Yeah,
for charging, but even that's quite difficult. So in a way, there's got to be conversations with the landowners to say,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
we need to change this.
I got a bit told off a couple of weeks ago. I was at my local fast food place,
As you do.
as you do. Yeah, it wasn't KFC. It was another one. And they'd had some new charge points installed um, by my favourite company, which we won't talk about. But yeah, the ones that regularly install at the fast food takeaways.
Okay.
Yeah. And even though I'd talked extensively with this company for a long time, now years now, and we've had meetings with them, face-to-face meetings, these charge points were installed totally inaccessibly. So I thought, okay, I'm going to take a photo. Unbeknownst to me, the manager was on a cigarette break outside of the McDonald's. Oh, did I say McDonald's? I didn't mean to say that. Anyway, yeah, he was outside with his uniform on, and he sort of said to me, "Excuse me, why are you taking photos?" So I had to explain to him. I said, "Well, this restaurant, which has been open 5-10 years, is fully accessible, which is great because you have to comply with the Equalities Act. So does your charging infrastructure, because that's, again, service to your customers. Why is that not accessible? What makes that
Different.
okay to not be accessible?" And he said, "I've never thought about it like that." He said, "What's the answer?" And I said, "Well, it is an easy answer, but you can't do it you can't make 2 parking bays into 2 charging bays. It's physically impossible. So there's always a business trade-off. But then you look at the business trade-off in cold light of day, you're going to lose parking spaces. So you're going to lose customers. Or are you? Are you going to lose customers? Because a disabled person who wants to charge now wouldn't go there. Are they not a customer?
Yes.
It all depends what you call a customer. It's, oftentimes people take disabled people out of the equation when it becomes a customer thing, a cost thing. But there's the purple pound. There is disabled people have buying power too. They pay tax as well. We all pay tax on everything we buy. So this whole tax thing. You go to McDonald's, you're paying VAT on most things, apart from milkshakes, whatever. So now I would go somewhere else if I wanted to eat and charge, because that isn't accessible to me. I couldn't get my wheelchair out and go in and eat there. So it's not always a black and white answer. You have to look at the whole dynamic of it. And if you create charge points which are more welcoming, are safer, they are nicer to use, it will attract people. And if you combine that with places where you can eat, drink, whatever. I was talking to one charge point operator on social media, on LinkedIn, and I criticised the new layout they'd done, which they said was accessible. And I said, well, it's not. And they then came back to me and said, well, you said this other layout from a different company was accessible, and they look very much the same. And I said, on the face of it, they do. The difference being yours, their installation was bounded by a curb at the end, so it wasn't 360 access. And also you've got 1 charge point out of 12. The other company, they're not bound by a curb at the end, it's 360 access all the way around, and all their charge points are like that. They're very unusual that this company does all their charge points like that, but they're all like that. So when I roll up, I'm not restricted to that one bay. I can choose any bay.
Yes.
And then, of course, that opens all questions down the line. We are going to have queuing as we move forward into the future. A lot of people talked about queuing and how you instigate a good queuing procedure, but then a whole new level of complexity is I'm 6th in the queue. There's 1 accessible bay that I need to use. None of the others are any use to me. If that bay becomes accessible, can I jump the queue to get to that 1 bay? And if I don't, and somebody else goes in it that doesn't need an accessible bay, and then it's my turn, what do I do? Because I can't move forward. there has to be a system in place. There is ways and means around it. I believe you just got to use a bit of imagination. You know, a lot of disabled people have a blue badge. Why are the blue badges not chipped? You put a chip in your cat, you put a chip in your dog. It's not an expensive thing.
No.
Your blue badge could be the activator to flag up on some sort of system that you need
That
space
bay.
that
You should
bay,
be able to book that bay.
or just make them all accessible. You know, that's.
I mean, that would make sense. And actually, since lockdown, a lot of these kind of supermarkets or you know, kind of lots of places with that we used to have lots and lots of footfall, shopping centres, etc., etc. I'm not saying they always do. This is the same everywhere, but a lot of them, especially like in Reading, we've had less footfall going in. So much so that some of our shopping centre one of the shopping centres in Reading, some of it's going to be shut down.
Yeah.
You
People's
know?
habits have changed.
Yeah, exactly. So if you've got less footfall, then actually, why can't they change the bays? To make them bigger, so across, like you said, for the company that does it the same for everybody. Well, you've got less people coming, so you need less spaces.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let's think about it that way.
It's a logical. You just got to think about logic. You got to think about it customer centric and logically. And too much development is done from we've created this thing, and we're going to force it onto you. Whereas not from the other way. It's like what would most people want, you know, and put yourselves in other people's shoes, which is vital. You know, even lockdown created a whole different dynamic, especially if you're disabled, because a lot of times it was the disabled bays that went because they became the queuing for people to get into the shops. You're in the shops, and so you go into the shops and you only had the one person, which was, if you're disabled, it's sometimes you don't shop on your own. Then they put the barriers in place, you know, with the so for me, I can't now use easily the tills because you can't. You've got a big. You can't reach over to get the stuff, and then they put it's gone backwards terribly. We've gone about 45 years backwards in terms of accessibility, and people just don't realise it. They've just taken it as a given, and a lot of it is needed, but you have to consider everybody when you do these things. Not just put.
That's the equality, diversity, and inclusion. That's the whole point.
Exactly. Anyway, and we are desperately missing out. I mean, even down to things like, I don't know if I mentioned it in London, VAT on fuel, on electricity.
Yeah.
It hits those hardest that need to charge out and about, because at home you can get 5% VAT.
Yes.
But if you're lower waged, which a lot of people are, you don't have that luxury of being able to charge at home, which means you've got to use public infrastructure, which means you're paying 15% more VAT. But then you can take it to a whole new level. You can't even access cheap rate electricity. So, for example, like I'm on Octopus, whatever it is, I forget. There's so many octopuses. But So I can charge for 7.5p overnight, whereas if you're using public infrastructure for, you know, destination charging, you're possibly looking at 75p. That's 10 times more for a segment of the population that can't often afford it, because you tend to find the more disposable income you've got, the more likely to have a home with off-street parking. Not always the case, but, you know, especially in the cities, but predominantly that's what happens. You know, you get a bigger house, you've got a driveway, possibly garage, you know. So the higher up you go on your home situation, the cheaper it becomes to charge. What a strange dynamic.
Isn't it? It does seem about it's cockeyed, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So we have to leverage, and I know a lot of people talk about technology, and I'm not a great one technology wise, as you realized from me trying to get this thing working, but you've got to have a way of being able to identify that some people haven't got the option of charging at home, but still need to be able to access a cheaper rate at some point.
Yeah.
Electricity, like the rest of us do. And then, of course, we need to look at things like, should I say DPD? Yeah, I'll say DPD. DPD vans, who are populating all the charge points. Yes, they have to charge up to, but that's a commercial operation, and their vans arrive at 7 in the evening and arrive at 7 in the morning, and they lock out all the charges because they're charged in a couple of hours, but they just sit there. But I've had that conversation with DPD as well.
And I get it, because some of the DPD, I think that they buy their own vans.
They
as
do,
well,
yes.
don't they?
So they're
so
working as a,
it's difficult for them as well. There are aspects of problems across all of this, and I think probably I hope, I've got to say this, Ian, and I'll finish in a second, but I hope that in the future, things will. I mean, things are. We're on a turning point now, aren't we? We're getting got over a million EV drivers in the UK. We've got 60,000 charge points. The petrol and diesel pumps, or the petrol stations, did not pop up overnight. They probably got it wrong, didn't they, the first time?
Well, I mean, you started off, you had to go to the chemist to buy your petrol back in the.
Oh my God, I don't even remember that.
No, that's back in the 20s, because obviously electric
you're not that
vehicles.
old, are you?
No, you see,
neither am I.
Ironically, what made internal combustion engines viable was electricity. Starter motors. Before starter motors, people didn't like hand cranking a car, so electric vehicles were more popular. When you got starter motors, you could then do it nicely. But yeah, you started off with, so for example, having to buy petrol at your local chemists. Then it moved to, I mean, I'm sure you've seen in more rural locations where they got filling pumps in front of houses which have been converted to garages. Do you remember those? So that was then the thing. Then of course nozzles weren't standard either. The ZVA nozzle became the standard, but it took a long time to get there. And so yeah, it has to evolve. But of course, no accessibility was never looked at, because disabled people back in those days, this is going to sound really awful, they were locked away predominantly, locked out of sight, out of mind sort of thing. I'm sure you remember the penny in the little figure of the girl with the braces on out in front of the shops. Do you remember that? There used to be.
Yeah,
do you remember that?
Maybe.
Yeah, it's like deep in the back of your mind, it's there. So that was the caricature. But now, of course, disabled people have been encouraged to take a more prominent role in society, which is great. But you have to make society inclusive. So I was sort of saying to you earlier, it's a difference between the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. And the medical model is what's persistent, in that a disabled person is broken, needs fixing, and society is fine. The social model is a disabled person's got an impairment. They can function perfectly if society is constructed in a way to let them. It's society which disables that person. Steps into a shop, for example, steps into a shop with a bell at the top. Ring this bell for attention. Yeah, how do I get to the bell? It's at the top of the steps. Little things like that.
Yeah.
So it's everybody needs to work together. There's going to be a multitude of different answers to this, but we've got to move forward, because if we don't, we're going to take out a whole section of the population where they're not able to earn, they're not able to go out to the cinema. If you don't go out to the cinema, that's generating income in the local. It all makes society move around. It has to be people spending money. And if you haven't got the freedom to move independently, you don't have that freedom to spend money. So yeah, I mean, Chris says a very good thing, who I do some work with. Chris, yeah, he's a disability trainer, and it sounds brutal, but it is actually true. And I think I can't remember exactly how he says it, but he says something like, he asks a room of people, who here is disabled? And then he says, actual fact, unless you die a very quick death, you will all become disabled, because that's what happens. We fail as we get older. Bits start failing.
Yeah. My mum had a Zimmer frame,
Yeah,
couldn't get around without it. So yeah, because I remember you saying
yeah,
that when I was there in London and actually thought about it, and I just thought, no, you're right. As we get old, we do have problems
we
like this.
do. Yeah,
So actually, if we don't do something now, we're stopping ourselves from being supported
yes,
when we're old.
we are shooting ourselves in the foot.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As we go, and it's a very short termism
Mm.
viewpoint. We have to be long term. Um, that brings us back to politics, but we have to have a long term outlook in everything in life, because the climate change situation is a long term thing.
Yeah.
No matter what we do now, we've pretty much set a path in place that's going to not affect us, but generations to come. The whole
Mm.
way, as the whole way our climate works, we're not going to turn things around overnight.
No.
You
And
know,
and the biggest thing is we have to give her stuff, don't we?
yes.
That's the
You know,
thing.
we
We've got to give her stuff. We've got to give
we got
stuff
to think.
now, not
Yes.
in the future, or go, oh, it's all right. Our kids will sort that out, because
No,
that's just a load of old tosh. I
I
could
get
do
I
with it,
get
but I'm not.
annoyed by the people saying saving the planet. We're not saving the planet. The planet's going to carry on fine. The planet, nature will always find a way. Humans won't be involved in that because we'll be extinct, but nature will find a way.
Oh, I think should we leave this on a high note at some point?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's the reality of it. It's just sort of like people. Humans have too much belief of their own self-importance. We're not important in the
Mm,
big scheme of things. We're not.
mm,
We're only screwing ourselves over.
I know. And
Reality,
our
and
future
that's the thing.
generations, exactly that.
Yes, yeah. But it's been
Oh,
lovely
oh,
chatting with you.
on that really
Oh, on
jolly,
that
jolly note.
positive note. Let's another. But no, that's why we've got to realise that there's lots of work to do. We've all got to work together, and only by working together can we all lead independent, meaningful. Not the word progressive, but yeah, really good
Progress.
progress.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And you say, don't you? Little changes. Has to be little changes, incremental changes. Got to be.
Incremental changes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Nobody likes big change. Sneak it through.
Oh, Ian, it's been a
Thank
joy
you.
talking to you. It's been so interesting. And I
Oh,
hope that
thanks.
everybody watching and listening has actually got something, and and you do start recognizing these things for people who've got accessibility needs. Please start looking
Yeah.
at, if you've got an EV or you've not got an EV, or you're thinking about getting an EV, have a look at the charging, kind of where everything is, and whether that would be accessible to
And
somebody in a
that's the
wheelchair.
thing. We can't have the attitude, it doesn't affect me, it's not my issue. If
Mm,
everybody looked at something from a different viewpoint, they would then say to whoever, like I say to people, why is this installation you put in that's not accessible? They don't need it to be accessible themselves, but if they recognize that it's not accessible for others, bring it up, make it socially unacceptable. Like now it's socially unacceptable to smoke, or socially
yeah,
unacceptable to drink and drive. Make
yeah.
it socially unacceptable. So it's only through that socially unacceptable level can we put overall pressure on people to make change. And it's got to be about making change.
Yes, I like that.
Definitely.
Ian, thank you ever so much for your time.
Thank you.
It's been really, really interesting. I'm going to
Spot
say
on.
thank you, thank you to everybody else for watching and listening, and I shall see you all next time.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye. Bye.
Thanks for watching this episode of Electric Evolution. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons to stay connected with us. And if you're inspired by our journey towards a sustainable future and want to support our mission on a monthly basis, please check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/Electric Evolution Podcast. Your support really helps us to bring the latest insights and discussions in the world of clean energy, electric vehicles, electric vehicle charging and sustainability to you. If a regular subscription isn't what you're looking for, you can always consider buying us a coffee. Just head over to www.buymeacoffee.com/Electric Evolution Podcast. Every cup helps us to keep the electric evolution moving forwards. And if you're curious about our work in the EV infrastructure sector at Full Circle Continuous Improvement, why not visit us at www fullcircleci.co.uk to find out more. And if you want to send me a message, you can always email me on liz@fullcircleci.co.uk. And finally, please don't forget to share this podcast if it sparked your interest. And let's keep spreading the word about all of these topics that we're covering. So, until next time, see you soon. Bye!